Royalty was supposed to be the pinnacle of human civilization. Turns out, giving people unlimited power and zero consequences made them absolutely feral. One king on this list still has people leaving potatoes on his grave. And honestly, he earned it. I'm Mike with List 25, and these are 25 little-known facts about monarchs. 25. The Mechanic King. Running a country sounds like a full-time gig, but King Bansa of Ghana disagrees. Tongbe Ngorifia Sefaskosi Bansa lives in Germany, where he works as a mechanic, complete with grease-stained overalls and a shop full of cars waiting for repairs. He traveled to Germany in 1970 as part of an exchange program, trained as a mechanic, and eventually earned Master Craftsman certificates in both agricultural machinery and vehicle mechanics. Then, in 1987, his grandfather passed away, and Bansa was next in line for the throne. He became the Ngorifia of the Be traditional area of Hohoe in eastern Ghana, a role focused on promoting development and cultural continuity rather than formal political power. Today, he balances royal duties with running his auto repair workshop in Ludwigshafen. His week might include diagnosing engine trouble in the morning and consulting with village elders over video call in the afternoon. He's installed wells, built schools, and funded medical clinics, all while changing oil and rotating tires back in Germany. The crown fits surprisingly well with the coveralls. 24. The Great Escape. Before he became King Edward I of England, he was a prisoner with a plan. While being held captive by Simon de Montfort during the Second Barons' War, Edward noticed an opportunity in what seemed like a simple request. He asked to ride the guards' horses, and they let him. So, Edward took each horse out one by one and ran them ragged over the course of an afternoon, while his captors assumed he was just killing time. By the time he mounted the last fresh horse, every other animal was too exhausted to give chase. He rode off without a fight, eventually regrouping with his supporters and turning the tide of the entire war. By the time the guards figured out what had happened, Edward was long gone, and they were stuck explaining how they'd been outsmarted by a guy on horseback. Sometimes the best escape plans don't involve tunnels or disguises, only cardio and cunning. 23. The Monkey's Bite. King Alexander of Greece was 27, and all things considered, life was pretty good. Then came October 2nd, 1920. While walking on the grounds of the royal estate at Tatoe with his German shepherd Fritz, his dog got into a scuffle with one of the palace monkeys. Alexander stepped in to break it up, and that's when a second monkey attacked him from behind, biting him deeply on the leg and torso. At first, nobody thought much of the wounds, but they got infected quickly, and sepsis followed. The doctors talked about amputating his leg, but nobody wanted to be the one to make that call if it didn't work. They waited too long. 23 days later, the king was gone. His passing threw Greece into political chaos and led to his exiled father returning to the throne. Winston Churchill later remarked that 250,000 people may have lost their lives due to the instability that followed, all because of one territorial monkey on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. 22. The Dancing Sun King. Louis XIV of France didn't only rule from a throne. He also performed on a stage. The Sun King was an obsessive ballet dancer who performed over 80 roles throughout his career, approaching the workload of a professional performer. His most famous appearance came in 1653, when, at just 15, he took the stage as Apollo the Sun God in a production called the Ballet Royal de la Nuit. The whole thing ran 12 hours, stretching from sundown to sunrise, with chariots crossing the skies and winged horses dipping through the clouds. At the finale, the young king stepped out in a jewel-encrusted costume and literally played the rising sun, driving away the darkness. That performance earned him the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, the Sun King. Louis went on to establish the Académie Royale de Danse in 1661, which became the foundation for professional ballet training in France. The next time you see a ballet, remember that its modern form exists partly because a 17th century monarch loved to dance. 21. The French king who became a saint. King Louis IX of France is the only French monarch ever officially canonized as a saint, and he earned that title through decades of remarkable conduct. Known for deep piety and personal austerity, Louis invited the poor and beggars to dine with him every single day, sometimes personally serving them at the table to emphasize humility and charity. He also pushed major legal reforms, reducing the reliance on trial by combat and promoting evidence-based procedures instead. That shift helped move France's justice toward a more rational system that didn't depend on who could swing a sword better. Louis led 2 crusades during his reign and lived a life so committed to Christian virtues that the church venerated him after he passed away in 1270. 20. The vote that ended a king. King Louis XVI of France was sentenced to the guillotine in 1793, but the vote was razor thin. The National Convention approved his execution by a majority of 1 vote, showing how divided the revolutionary government was over the fate of their former monarch. Among those who voted for his cousin's end was Louis-Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, who had renamed himself Philippe Égalité to align with revolutionary ideals. The 2 men already had a strained relationship, and Philippe's vote was widely seen as either a political survival move or an attempt to gain influence under the new regime. This gamble backfired spectacularly. 1 year later, during the Reign of Terror, Philippe found himself on the same scaffold that claimed his cousin. Voting to execute the king didn't buy him any loyalty, and it certainly didn't protect him from the revolution he helped create. 19. The English king who barely knew England. Richard the Lionheart is probably the most celebrated king in English history, but he had surprisingly little connection to the country he ruled. He grew up in Aquitaine and Anjou, spoke French as his native language, and knew only minimal English. At the time, the English court and nobility largely used French, so this wasn't considered unusual. What's wild is how little time he actually spent there. During his 10-year reign, from 1189 to 1199, Richard was physically in England for only about 6 months. Most of his rule was devoted to leading the Third Crusade, fighting in the Holy Land, getting captured on his way home, and later campaigning in his French territories. He treated England mainly as a source of money for his wars. Yet somehow, his military reputation and larger-than-life persona cemented him as one of history's most legendary English monarchs. 18. The King Who Was Flogged. Henry II of England carried a heavy burden after Archbishop Thomas Becket was struck down by 4 of his knights in 1170. Whether or not Henry actually said the famous words about wanting someone to rid him of that turbulent priest, his knights clearly believed they were doing what the king wanted. The fallout was immediate and severe, with the church and most of Europe turning against him. 4 years later, Henry walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury to the cathedral where Becket had been slain. He spent the entire night fasting and praying at Becket's tomb, and when morning came, he knelt down and let the monks take turns flogging him. Around 80 of them lined up with rods and whips, and Henry took every blow without fighting back. It was a calculated act of public penance, and it worked. His relationship with the church improved, the political pressure eased, and Becket's reputation as a martyr only grew stronger. Sometimes the best way to save your kingdom is to let a bunch of monks beat you in public. 17. The Pickpocket King. King Farouk of Egypt, who ruled from 1936 to 1952, earned the nickname the Pickpocket King due to his notorious habit of stealing personal items from visitors and fellow dignitaries. I'm not talking about swiping a pen off a desk. The man lifted Winston Churchill's pocket watch and kept it as a trophy. Nobody was safe around him. It didn't matter how important you were, nor what country you came from. If you visited Farouk, there was a decent chance you were leaving without something you came in with. The guy had a problem, and he also happened to be running a country. When he was overthrown in 1952, the new government went through his palaces and found what was reportedly the world's largest private collection of adult content at the time, along with piles of other bizarre and expensive stuff he'd accumulated. Farouk wasn't just a thief, he was a hoarder with a crown. 16. The Queen's Secret Service. Queen Elizabeth I of England faced constant threats to her life and reign, so she responded by building one of history's first sophisticated spy networks. Sir Francis Walsingham, her principal secretary, became legendary for creating a highly effective intelligence operation that spanned Europe. His network employed double agents, covert propaganda, and cryptanalysts who specialized in cracking coded messages. The operation's greatest success was the Babington Plot of 1586, when Walsingham's agents intercepted encrypted letters to and from Mary, Queen of Scots, hidden in beer barrels. The coded messages showed evidence of a conspiracy against Elizabeth and led directly to Mary's execution. Walsingham's methods anticipated techniques that wouldn't become routine in intelligence services for centuries. Interestingly, one of his spies signed reports with the codename 007, centuries before a certain fictional agent made those numbers famous. The original license to spy, you might say. 15. The Rebellious Heir. Speaking of royal family drama, Henry the Young King takes the cake. He was the eldest son of Henry II of England and was actually crowned as junior king during his father's lifetime, a rare practice meant to secure the succession. Despite holding the title, he had no real power, and that frustration drove him to repeatedly rebel against his own father. After being defeated in one revolt, he launched another uprising, demonstrating both ambition and a complete inability to accept his secondary status. Then, dysentery got him at 28, and he never got the chance to rule on his own. He spent his whole life wearing a crown that didn't actually mean anything. That's a special kind of royal tragedy, and a reminder that wearing the title doesn't always mean holding the power. 14. The King Who Hated Bad Breath. In 1193, King Philip II of France married Ingeborg of Denmark, but their marriage got off to a rocky start. On their wedding night, Philip reportedly found that Ingeborg had extremely unpleasant breath. He was so offended that he refused to have her crowned as Queen of France and immediately sought to annul the marriage. Philip's refusal sparked a long and bitter conflict with both Ingeborg and the church. The Pope repeatedly ordered him to reconcile with his wife, but Philip delayed and resisted for years. Ingeborg remained legally married and was recognized as queen in title, but she endured a lengthy period of neglect and humiliation while her husband pursued other relationships. He literally fought with the Catholic Church for over a decade, until eventually, after about 20 years, Philip finally gave in and accepted Ingeborg as his queen. In an ironic twist, she outlived him by over a decade. 13. The Flying Dutch King. King Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands kept a secret from the flying public for over 21 years. Before becoming monarch in 2013, he had been secretly working as a first officer for Koninklijke Luchtvaartmaatschappij, better known as KLM Royal Dutch Airlines. Twice a month, he flew on commercial flights, performing all responsibilities like any other crew member while wearing the standard pilot uniform. He kept flying even after he took the throne. Most passengers had no idea their co-pilot was actually royalty. The king eventually revealed his secret identity in 2017, explaining that he found flying relaxing, and that passengers rarely recognized him in uniform. When your day job involves running a country, sometimes you need to decompress at 35,000 feet. It's probably the only time no one asks him to cut a ribbon or give a speech. 12. The Potsdam Giants. King Frederick William I of Prussia had an unusual obsession with tall soldiers, and he channeled that obsession into creating an elite regiment known as the Potsdam Giants. The king prized height above everything else, no pun intended, with the taller soldiers receiving higher pay and privileges. The cutoff was around 6'2", which was exceptionally tall for the era when the average height was considerably shorter. He went to extreme lengths to recruit them, hiring mercenaries from across Europe and encouraging tall men and women to have children together in hopes of producing future giants. Neighboring kingdoms even sent their tallest fighters as diplomatic gifts. Here's the twist, though. Despite their impressive stature and rigorous training, these men were never sent into actual battle. William considered them too valuable and prestigious to risk in combat. They existed purely as a symbol of his power and eccentricity, parading around without ever seeing war. 11. From gold medal glory to exile. King Alexander's monkey bite story was wild, but his great-nephew Constantine II didn't exactly have it easy either. Constantine was an Olympic athlete before he ever wore a crown. He won gold in sailing at the 1960 Rome Games, ending a 48-year drought for Greece and turning himself into a national hero overnight. 4 years later, he was king at just 23 years old. And that's when everything started to unravel. Greece was a political mess, and Constantine's relationship with the elected government quickly fell apart. When a military junta seized power in 1967, he tried to launch a counter-coup, but it failed, and he had to flee the country with his family. The monarchy was abolished a few years later, and Constantine spent the next 4 decades bouncing between Italy and England while Greece moved on without him. He eventually made it back as a private citizen, but the throne was long gone. The Olympic hero turned young king ended up a man without a country. 10. The Potato King. Frederick the Great of Prussia faced a challenge in the 18th century when he tried to introduce potatoes as a staple crop. But the peasants weren't having it. People hated potatoes, claiming they tasted and looked bad. They mistrusted foods that grew underground, and some feared that they could cause leprosy. So Frederick came up with a plan that was either genius or insane. He ordered the soldiers to guard the potato fields, creating the impression that the crop was highly valuable and restricted to royalty. Curiously, the peasants stole the potatoes at night and began cultivating them in their own gardens, thinking they had something special. The whole scheme worked better than he could have hoped. The once despised vegetable became a reliable source of nutrition that helped prevent food shortages, and Frederick is still remembered in Germany today. Visitors still leave potatoes on his grave as a tribute to the king who tricked his people into better nutrition. 9. The Clock-Obsessed Emperor. The Qianlong Emperor of China had a fascination that bordered on obsession. He accumulated a collection of nearly 400 clocks during his reign from 1735 to 1795, making him one of history's most dedicated collectors. He even had moving figures that danced and played music, and they were designed to look like the kind of things the emperor actually wanted to see around his palace. British craftsmen figured out pretty quickly that there was serious money to be made here. A clockmaster named James Cox built an entire business around creating pieces specifically for the Chinese market. But for the emperor, this wasn't just about having fancy decorations. In Chinese tradition, being able to predict celestial events was tied to the emperor's authority. Owning the most elaborate and accurate pieces in the world was a way of proving he had a direct line to the heavens. Most of them are still in the Forbidden City today, and every single one is a reminder that this guy really loved knowing what time it was. 8. A Royal Fall. Bela I of Hungary spent 17 years in exile after his father was executed. He came back, went to war with his own brother for the throne, and won. For 3 years he ruled Hungary, put down rebellions, and kept the Holy Roman Empire from putting his nephew on the throne instead. The man had been through hell and survived it all. Then one afternoon in 1063, while he was preparing for yet another war, the wooden canopy above his throne collapsed and crushed him. This couldn't have happened at a worse time. The Holy Roman Empire was already planning an invasion, and a dying king meant a vulnerable kingdom. His men rushed him toward the border, hoping to get him somewhere safe before word spread, but he didn't make it. He died on the road, and his sons had to flee to Poland while his nephew took the crown. Some historians think the collapse was sabotage, and given the timing, it's hard to blame them. 7. The Royally Inked. If you've ever seen a picture of King George V, you know the guy looked like he was born in a military uniform. Everything about him screamed proper British monarch. But what most people don't know was that George was walking around with 2 tattoos. He got them while serving in the Royal Navy, years before he ever expected to sit on the throne. At the time, he was second in line, which meant he actually got to have a life. The Navy sent him all over the world, and during a stop in Japan, he decided to bring back something a little more permanent than a souvenir. He got a dragon on one arm to represent the East, and a tiger on the other to represent the West, marking all the places he'd been before duty dragged him back to England. For the rest of his life, George kept them hidden under those stiff royal uniforms, and hardly anyone knew they were there. 6. The Pirate King. King Eric of Pomerania was running Denmark, Sweden, and Norway all at once in the early 1400s, which sounds impressive, until you realize how badly he screwed it up. He taxed every ship coming through the Baltic, blew the money on wars he couldn't win, and kept promoting Danes to all the top jobs while the Swedes and Norwegians got nothing. The peasants hated him, the nobles hated him, and by 1439, all three kingdoms had kicked him out. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Instead of crawling off to some quiet corner and feeling sorry for himself, Eric sailed to the island of Gotland and became an actual pirate. He joined a gang called the Vitalienbrüder and spent the next 10 years attacking merchant ships on the same waters he used to control as king. At one point, somebody offered to let him come back as king of Norway if he wanted, and Eric turned them down flat. He said he'd rather be a pirate chief than go back to being royalty. He kept robbing ships until 1449, when the Swedes finally kicked him off Gotland, and he went back to Pomerania to live out his final years. He'd gone from ruling 3 countries to raiding ships to retiring in the same place he was born, and by all accounts, he had no regrets. 5. The King Prime Minister. Simeon II was 6 when he became King of Bulgaria in 1943. 3 years later, the communists took over, declared Bulgaria a republic, and sent the kid and his family packing. He spent the next 5 decades in exile, mostly in Spain, living as a private citizen while his homeland went through communist rule and eventually emerged on the other side. Then, in 2001, he returned and ran for prime minister, and the Bulgarian people actually elected him. The former child king who'd been booted out of his own country was now running it again, except this time because people had voted for him. He served until 2005, which means Simeon is the only person in European history who can say he led the same country twice, once as a monarch and once as a democratically elected leader. That is one heck of a political comeback story. 4. The soldier who became king through kindness. Jean Bernadotte didn't come from money or connections. He was just a French soldier who happened to be really good at his job. And that's how he ended up as one of Napoleon's top marshals. The thing that changed his life happened during the Napoleonic Wars when he ended up in charge of a bunch of Swedish prisoners. Back then, most commanders couldn't care less what happened to enemy captives. But Bernadotte fed them properly and made sure they weren't mistreated. When those soldiers eventually made it back to Sweden, they couldn't stop talking about the French general who'd showed them basic human decency. Years later, Sweden needed a new king. Instead of choosing some royal cousin nobody liked, they reached out to Bernadotte. The guy had never even visited Sweden and didn't know a single word of Swedish, but they wanted him because of who he was. He said yes, changed his name to Charles XIV John, and started a royal line that's still ruling Sweden today. 3. The king who put a rat on trial. Tsar Peter III of Russia was a weird guy, even by the standards of 18th century royalty. He was obsessed with toy soldiers and spent hours arranging them and playing war games with them long after he was old enough to be running an empire. In 1762, a rat got into his collection and chewed the heads off some of his favorites. Peter completely lost it. He ordered soldiers to capture the rodent, then set up a formal court-martial where he charged it with treason against the crown. Witnesses testified, evidence was presented, and at the end of it all, the verdict was guilty. The sentence was death by hanging, and they actually went through with it. Full ceremony and everything. 6 months into his reign, Peter's wife Catherine decided she'd had enough of him and staged a coup. She took the throne and became one of Russia's greatest rulers, while Peter went down in history as the Tsar who held military tribunals for vermin. It's hard to command respect when everyone knows you once hanged a rodent for chewing on your toys. 2. The People's King. Most kings travel in motorcades surrounded by security, but King Olav V of Norway preferred to take the bus. He reigned from 1957 to 1991, and during that time, he became famous for riding public transportation, blending in with ordinary citizens during his daily life. During the 1973 oil crisis, when Norwegians were asked to limit their car use on Sundays, the king took the tram to go skiing, paying his own fare. When his driver offered to take him instead, he reportedly said the tram was good enough for everyone else, so it was good enough for him. Someone even snapped a photo of him sitting there like any other passenger, and that image became one of the most famous pictures in Norwegian history. The Norwegian people gave him the nickname Folket Kongen, which means the People's King, and it wasn't something any ceremony or title could have given him. He got it because he never acted like being a king made him better than anyone else. 1. The kings with all the shimmer. Aztec rulers wore cloaks made entirely from hummingbirds, and each one required around 8,000 of the tiny creatures to complete. Hunters spent months tracking down enough of them for a single garment, and then craftsmen had to arrange every feather so precisely that the finished cloak shimmered and shifted colors when it caught the sunlight. Nothing on Earth looked like it. These garments were reserved for the emperor and his most powerful nobles. Showing up draped in thousands of iridescent feathers left no questions about who held power. Crowns and thrones are impressive, but walking around in feathers and skins of 8,000 birds sends a message all on its own. Now, I don't know about you, but I am never going to look at a royal portrait the same way again. These were the most powerful people on the planet, and they were out here executing rats and stealing pocket watches from world leaders. And honestly, I barely scratched the surface. There are centuries of royal chaos I didn't even get to. If you want more, click here to check out 25 craziest things you might not know about kings. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe with the notification bell so you don't miss out on what we're going to put out next. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.